Have you ever thought silence could be so loud? Standing in the hallway of my childhood home, the quiet screamed of death. Then, the oak closet door cracked open, just a sliver. Inside the darkness, I heard breathing. It was not an animal, but the wheezing, broken gasps of a terrified human. When I pulled that door open, I realized hell was not underground. It was right here in my family, hiding behind a mask for 30 years. My name is James Williams. I am 32 years old, and if you looked at my life from the outside, you would probably say I had won the game. I am a senior architect at one of the most prestigious firms in Seattle. My apartment is on the 24th floor of a glass and steel monolith that pierces the gray sky, offering a panoramic view of the Space Needle and the choppy waters of Puget Sound. Everything in my life is curated clean and quiet. My furniture is Italian leather. My espresso machine cost more than my first car, and the air inside my home is always filtered and set to a perfect 70 degrees. I have spent my entire adult life building this fortress of solitude, constructing a reality that is the exact opposite of the chaotic, dirt-stained world I ran away from. But tonight, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, with a glass of scotch in my hand, the silence of my apartment does not feel like peace. It feels like a vacuum. It feels like the air before a thunderstorm. My roots are not in this rain-soaked city of technology and coffee. My roots are buried deep in the red dirt and snow of Stone Creek, Colorado. My parents, Thomas and Martha Williams, are ranchers. They are the kind of people who were carved out of the landscape itself, hard, unyielding, and weathered by the wind. They own 3,000 acres of cattle land that has been in the Williams family for 4 generations. It is a beautiful place in a desolate, terrifying way. It is a place where the mountains swallow the sun at 4 in the afternoon during winter, and where your nearest neighbor is a 2-mile drive down a gravel road. I left Stone Creek the morning after my 18th birthday. I packed a single duffel bag and drove my beat-up sedan west until the mountains were just a jagged line in my rearview mirror. I did not leave because I hated the land. I left because I could not breathe in that house. My father Thomas is a man who believes that affection is a weakness and that control is the only way to show love. He ran his family like he ran his herd, with an iron fist and a loud voice. And then there was my mother, Martha. She was softer, but her silence enabled him. She was the buffer, the one who would slip me an extra $20 or bandage a scraped knee, but she never once stood up to him when he tore me down. And he tore me down often. Mostly it was to compare me to Kevin. Kevin is my younger brother. He is 2 years my junior, and in my father's eyes, he could do no wrong. It is the classic tragic cliché of the prodigal son. Kevin was the wild one, the charming one, the one who wrecked the tractor and laughed about it, the one who gambled away his allowance and got a pat on the back for being a risk-taker. I was the responsible one. I got straight. As I did my chores before dawn, and I kept my head down. Yet I was the one who was never tough enough, never cowboy enough. Kevin stayed behind. He stayed to inherit the kingdom, even though everyone in town knew he would likely burn it to the ground within 5 years of getting the deed. I have not been back to the ranch in 4 years. However, guilt is a powerful tether. Despite the distance and the resentment, I maintained one unshakable ritual. Every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, my phone would ring. It would be my mother. We would talk for exactly 15 minutes. She would tell me about the weather, the price of feed, and the health of the herd. I would tell her about the rain in Seattle and vaguely mention my projects. It was a surface-level conversation, a weekly check-in to prove we were still family. My mother has never missed a Sunday call. Not when she had the flu, not when the blizzard of 2018 knocked out the power lines, and not when she was in the hospital for gallstones. She always found a way. Until last Sunday. Last Sunday at 9 in the morning, I sat by this window with my phone on the coffee table waiting. The screen remained dark. 9:15 came and went. Then 9:30. By 10 o'clock, a cold knot of unease had started to form in my stomach. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the lines were down. Maybe they were busy with a calving. I called the landline. It rang, and it rang, and it rang. There is a specific hollowness to a phone, ringing in an empty house, a sound that echoes in your imagination. I let it ring 20 times before hanging up. I tried my father's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. The automated voice told me the subscriber was unavailable. I tried my mother's cell phone. Same result. Then, I did the thing I hated doing most. I called Kevin. Calling Kevin is usually an invitation for a headache. He only answers when he needs money, and he only calls when he is in trouble. But I dialed his number, watching the rain streak against the glass. It rang 4 times. Then his voicemail picked up. It was a joke recording he had made years ago, something crude and loud. I hung up without leaving a message. That was 7 days ago. For 7 days, there has been nothing, no callback, no text, no email. The silence from Stone Creek has grown from a nagging worry into a deafening alarm bell ringing in my head. I went to work on Monday, trying to focus on the blueprints for a new library downtown, but my mind kept drifting back to the ranch. I called again during my lunch break. Nothing. I called on Tuesday evening. Nothing. By Wednesday, the rational part of my brain began to lose the argument against the instinctual part. I kept replaying our last conversation from the previous week. It had seemed normal at the time, but now in the vacuum of this silence, every nuance was magnified. My mother had sounded tired. That was not unusual. Ranch life is exhausting, but there was something else in her voice, a tremor. A hesitation. I remember asking her how things were going. She had paused for a long time. Then she said, "It is just the papers, James. Your father is worrying about the land papers." "What papers?" I had asked. "Is he selling?" "No," she had said quickly, too quickly. "No, of course not. You know he would never sell. It is just never mind. It is just business." She had changed the subject immediately, asking about my dating life, which was her usual way of deflecting tension. I had let it go. I was busy. I did not want to get dragged into another drama about property lines or grazing rights. Now, I would give anything to ask her what she meant. By Friday, the silence was unbearable. I knew Kevin was irresponsible. If my parents had gone out of town, Kevin might forget to tell me. But my parents never went out of town. They had not taken a vacation since 1995. The ranch was a prison they had built for themselves, and they were the diligent wardens. They would not leave the animals. This morning, Saturday, the anxiety finally boiled over. I looked up the number for the nearest neighbor, the Miller family. They live about 2 miles down the main road. Mr. Miller is an old friend of my father, though they fell out years ago over a water rights dispute. I dialed the number, my hand shaking slightly. Mrs. Miller answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Mrs. Miller. This is James Williams, Thomas and Martha's son." "Oh, James," she said, her voice surprised. "It has been a long time. How are you doing up in the city?" "I am fine, thank you. Listen, I hate to bother you, but have you seen my folks lately? I have not been able to reach them all week." There was a pause on the line. The static of a long-distance connection hissed in my ear. "Now that you mention it," she said slowly, "I have not seen Thomas's truck move since last weekend. Usually, he drives past here on his way to town on Tuesdays for supplies. I did not see him this Tuesday." "Have you seen any lights?" I asked, "or smoke from the chimney?" "Well, I do not stare at their house, James." "But, well, the nights have been dark over that way. And we had that snowstorm on Thursday. I assumed they were just bunkering down. Is everything all right?" "I do not know," I said, gripping the phone tight enough to turn my knuckles white. "I really do not know." "Do you want me to send Bob over to check?" she offered. "No," I said instantly. A sudden primal fear gripped me. I did not want anyone else going over there. If something was wrong, if something had happened, I needed to be the one to find it. I could not explain why, but I felt a sudden fierce protectiveness. Or maybe it was dread. No, thank you, Mrs. Miller. I am sure they are fine. Probably just a line down, like you said. I will keep trying. I hung up and looked at my reflection in the dark window. The successful architect in the designer suit looked back at me pale and terrified. No lights, no smoke, no movement for a week. In the city, if you disappear for a week, someone notices. Your boss calls, your doorman checks on you. In the high country of Colorado, you can die and turn to dust, and the world will just keep spinning. The isolation that my father prized so much, the solitude he wielded like a shield, had now become a threat. I looked at the clock. It was 6 p.m. If I left now and drove straight through, pushing the speed limit, I could be at the ranch by tomorrow evening. It is a long drive, over 1,000 miles, crossing mountain passes that are treacherous this time of year. Flying would be faster, but I needed my car. I needed the control. I needed to be able to leave whenever I wanted. I walked into my bedroom and pulled my travel bag from the closet. I threw in heavy coats, wool socks, and sturdy boots, clothes I had not worn in years. I went to the kitchen and packed a thermos of coffee and a box of protein bars. Then I sat down at my computer and typed a brief email to my partners at the firm. I told them a family emergency had come up. I did not give details. I did not know the details yet. As I took the elevator down to the parking garage, the silence of the building felt different. It was no longer the silence of luxury. It was the silence of anticipation. My Audi started with a low purr, a sound of refined engineering that felt ridiculously out of place for where I was heading. I pulled out onto the wet streets of Seattle, the tires hissing on the pavement. I merged onto the highway heading east, away from the ocean and toward the mountains. As the city lights faded behind me in the rearview mirror, replaced by the encroaching darkness of the Cascades, I felt a heavy weight settle on my chest. It was the weight of returning to a place you thought you had escaped. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe the storm had knocked out the power and the cell towers. Maybe they were just cold and huddled under blankets, drinking whiskey and complaining about the government. Maybe Kevin had lost his phone again. But as I drove into the night, the image of that house haunted me. The sprawling timber structure, sitting alone on the rise, surrounded by miles of barbed wire and empty fields. It was a house that held too many secrets, too many grudges. And now it was holding a silence that terrified me more than any shouting match my father and I ever had. 7 days. Why did she sound so scared about the papers? Why did she cut the call short? And why, for the love of God, did I have this sinking feeling that I was not driving toward a reunion, but toward a crime scene? The road stretched out before me, black and endless. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. I had to get home. I had to know. The silence had to be broken. The interstate dissolved behind me, replaced by the twisting, narrow veins of the state highways that snaked through the Rockies. I had been driving for nearly 20 hours, fueled only by lukewarm coffee and the gnawing anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. The further I drove from Seattle, the more the world seemed to shrink. The sprawling, civilized grid of the coast gave way to jagged peaks and valleys swallowed by shadow. It was a landscape that did not care if you lived or died. By the time I crossed the state line into Colorado, the weather had turned on me. The sky was a bruised purple heavy and low, pressing down on the tops of the pine trees. Snow began to fall. It started as lazy, drifting flakes, but within an hour it had transformed into a white curtain that slashed diagonally across my windshield. My high beams caught the driving snow, turning it into a hypnotic tunnel of white streaks. I had to slow the Audi down to a crawl, the tires crunching over fresh powder that concealed patches of black ice. The temperature gauge on my dashboard dropped steadily. 30 degrees, 25, 18. The isolation was absolute. There were no other cars, no house lights flickering on the hillsides, just the relentless sweep of the wiper blades and the hum of the engine. In this sensory deprivation tank, my mind turned inward, dredging up the ghosts I had driven 1,000 miles to avoid. My thoughts circled back to Kevin. They always did. Even now, with the possibility of a family tragedy looming over the dashboard, I could not suppress the bitter taste of bile that rose in my throat when I thought of my brother. Kevin was the golden boy. He was the one who could do no wrong, even though his life was a catalog of disasters. I remembered the Christmas of 2022. I had come home for a brief obligatory visit. Kevin had been there, vibrating with a manic energy that usually meant he was high or in deep trouble. He had borrowed $5,000 from my father's retirement account to invest in some online cryptocurrency scheme. When the money vanished into the digital ether, I expected my father to finally explode. I expected consequences. Instead, I watched Thomas Williams, the man who once grounded me for a month for scratching the paint on the tractor, sit at the kitchen table and write Kevin a check to cover his rent. "He is trying James," my mother had whispered to me in the kitchen, her eyes pleading with me not to start a fight. "He just has bad luck." Bad luck. That was the family motto for Kevin. It was not bad luck that he gambled away his tuition money. It was not bad luck that he got a DUI on his 21st birthday. It was a lack of accountability fostered by parents who were too terrified of losing their favorite son to discipline him. I was the backup plan, the steady, boring insurance policy, living in Seattle. Kevin was the high-stakes investment they kept pouring emotional capital into, hoping one day it would pay off. But my anger softened when the image of Sarah floated into my mind. Sarah, my baby sister. She is 25 years old now, but in her mind, she is eternally 5. She was born with complications, a lack of oxygen that left her permanently suspended in a state of childhood innocence. Sarah did not know about mortgages or gambling debts or family feuds. She knew about her collection of porcelain dolls. She knew that she loved strawberry ice cream and the color yellow. She knew that when I came home, I would spin her around until she was dizzy with laughter. Leaving her behind was the only thing that made me hesitate when I packed my bags at 18. I remember the day I left. She had been sitting on the front porch, clutching a ragged teddy bear, waving at my car until I turned the bend. The guilt of that memory felt heavier than the snow piling up on the road. I had justified it by telling myself I could send money. I could pay for better doctors, better clothes. I could help from a distance, but money could not protect her. If my parents were gone or hurt or unable to care for her, Sarah would be helpless. She could not cook a meal. She could not light a fire. The thought of her alone in that big, drafty house made my grip on the steering wheel tighten until my fingers ached. I reached Stone Creek just as the last of the daylight was bleeding out of the sky. The town was little more than a main street with a gas station, a post office, and a diner that had not changed its menu since the 80s. Under the assault of the blizzard, the town looked like a graveyard. The streetlights were dim, struggling to pierce the swirling whiteout. There was not a single soul on the sidewalks. The open sign in the diner window was dark. It felt as if the entire population had boarded up their windows and hidden in the cellar, waiting for an apocalypse. I drove through the center of town without stopping my tires, carving fresh tracks in the untouched snow. The ranch was another 6 miles out, up a winding dirt road that climbed into the foothills. As I turned onto the road leading to the Williams property, the dread that had been a low hum in my gut roared into a scream. The main gate was open. This might seem insignificant to a city dweller, but on a cattle ranch, an open gate is a cardinal sin. It is the first rule you learn. You never ever leave a gate open. Cattle wander. Predators enter. My father was obsessive about the gates. He would stop the truck and check a latch 3 times before driving away. To see the heavy iron gate swung wide, burying its bottom rail in a snowdrift was wrong. It was fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. I drove through, the cattle guard rumbling beneath my tires. I rolled down my window, letting the freezing wind whip snow into my face, listening. Above the howl of the wind I heard them. The cattle. They were not lowing contentedly. They were bellowing. It was a ragged, desperate sound, the sound of animals that had been in distress for a long time. I slowed the car as I passed the main pasture. In the high beams I saw them huddled together against the fence line, their coats matted with ice. They looked thin. They were pressing against the barbed wire, their eyes reflecting the light in eerie, glowing orbs. Horses in the paddock near the barn were kicking at the wood, their shrill whinnies cutting through the storm. My father would never let an animal go hungry. He would starve himself before he let the herd suffer. If the animals had not been fed, it meant there was no one left to feed them. I crested the final hill, and the house came into view. It was a sprawling 2-story log structure built to withstand the harshest winters. But tonight, it looked defeated, dark. There was not a single light burning in any window. It was a black void against the dark gray sky. I pulled my car up the circular drive and stopped behind my father's pickup truck. I stared at it, my heart hammering against my ribs. The Ford F-150 was buried. A smooth, unbroken blanket of snow covered the hood, the roof, and the bed. The snow in Stone Creek had started 3 days ago, according to the weather report I checked. That meant this truck had not moved in at least 72 hours. Probably longer. The tires were partially submerged in a drift that had hardened into ice. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was sudden and violent. No engine hum, no radio, just the wind whistling around the eaves of the house and the distant, mournful cry of the cattle. I stepped out of the car, my boots sinking into the snow. The cold bit through my heavy coat instantly, but I barely felt it. I was numb with a different kind of chill. I walked toward the front porch. The stairs creaked under my weight, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet. When I reached the top step, I froze. The front door was not closed. It was unlatched, resting a few inches ajar. The wind would catch it, pushing it open slightly, and then the heavy oak would swing back, hitting the doorframe. Click, pause, click, pause, click. It was a mechanical, rhythmic heartbeat of a dying house. The deadbolt was disengaged. The brass handle was cold and lifeless. Snow had drifted into the foyer, forming a small, white dune on the hardwood floor. My mother would have had a fit if anyone tracked mud inside, let alone let snow pile up in the hallway. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed on the threshold. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get back in the car, drive to the police station, and let someone with a gun and a badge handle this. But I could not leave. Sarah was there. I had to believe she was in there. "Dad," I called out. My voice cracked. It sounded small, pathetic against the roaring wind. "Mom, Sarah," I waited. I strained my ears, hoping for the sound of footsteps, a voice asking who was there, even the bark of the family dog. Nothing. Just the wind hissing through the crack in the door, and the rhythmic click-click of the wood hitting the frame. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. I pushed the door open with my hand. It swung inward with a groan of dry hinges that set my teeth on edge. I stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was not a sound but a smell. It was thick and cloying, an assault on the senses that made me gag. It was the smell of a house that had stopped living. Beneath the scent of old wood and cold air, there was the sharp, sour reek of spoilage. It smelled like milk that had curdled in the heat. It smelled like meat that had been left out on the counter for days, slowly turning green and liquefying. It was the smell of rot. I shone the light down the hallway. The shadows stretched and twisted, looking like long, dark fingers reaching out to grab me. The air inside was freezing, almost as cold as the air outside. The furnace was dead. "Hello!" I yelled again, louder this time, trying to inject some authority into my voice. "Is anyone here?" My shout echoed through the high ceilings of the living room and died away upstairs. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a threat I could not yet see. I took another step forward, the floorboards groaning in protest. I was an intruder in my own childhood home, walking into the belly of a beast that had swallowed my family whole. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white, and moved deeper into the stench. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the stagnant air, revealing a scene that looked less like a home and more like a battlefield. The foyer, usually pristine, was littered with debris. As I moved deeper into the living room, the full extent of the violence hit me with the force of a physical blow. My mother prided herself on this room. It was her sanctuary, filled with antique furniture she had restored herself and hand-woven rugs she treated with reverence. Now it was a graveyard of memories. The heavy oak coffee table was overturned, its legs pointing up at the ceiling, like the limbs of a dead animal. The ceramic lamps that had sat on the end tables were shattered, their shards scattered across the Persian rug like jagged teeth. I swept the light across the walls and my heart stuttered. The family portraits. The wall above the fireplace, which had been a gallery of the Williams family history, was decimated. But it was not random destruction. I stepped closer, the glass crunching loudly under my boots. The photos of my parents were smashed, the frames broken, but the pictures themselves were intact. The photos of Kevin were untouched, hanging straight and perfect amidst the chaos. But the photos of me, they were obliterated. My graduation photo, my portrait from the architectural firm, a candid shot of me on a horse from 10 years ago. Every single image of my face had been ripped from the wall, the glass pulverized, the paper torn into confetti and scattered on the floor. It was a targeted, hateful erasure. Someone had stood here in the middle of this violence and taken the time to systematically destroy my image. The hatred radiating from the shreds of paper made my skin crawl. I turned away, sickened, and the light caught something on the far wall near the entrance to the kitchen. There was a dent in the plaster. It was about the size of a grapefruit, deep and cracked, located about 5 feet off the ground. It looked like someone had thrown a heavy object, a vase, maybe a statue with immense force. Or maybe they had thrown a person. I moved closer to the dent. Below it, on the polished hardwood floor, were spots. They were dark, almost black in the dim light of my phone, but I knew what color they would be in the daylight. They were a rusty, dried red. Blood. I crouched down, touching one of the spots. It was dry and flaky. It had been there for days. It was not a pool, not enough to indicate a death right there, but enough to say that someone had been hurt. Badly. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Dad." There was no answer. Just the house, settling around me, groaning in the wind. I stood up and forced myself to walk into the kitchen. The smell I had noticed at the front door was overpowering here. I covered my nose with my sleeve. The flashlight beam swept over the kitchen island. Dinner was still on the table. 3 plates were set out. The food on them had transformed into unrecognizable mounds of fuzzy gray and green mold. I stepped closer, squinting. It looked like it had been roast beef and mashed potatoes. Forks were resting on the edges of the plates. A glass of milk had curdled into a solid yellow lump. Napkins were crumpled. They had been eating. They had sat down for a meal just like any other night, and then something had happened. Something so sudden, so terrifying, that they had abandoned their food mid-bite. A chair was knocked over backward, lying on its side near the back door. It suggested a frantic retreat, a scramble to get away. I backed out of the kitchen, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I had to go upstairs. I had to check the bedrooms. The staircase loomed ahead of me, a tunnel into the dark upper reaches of the house. I gripped the banister. It felt sticky with dust. I took the steps two at a time, ignoring the screaming of the wood beneath my feet. At the top of the landing, I turned left toward the master bedroom. The door was wide open. I shone the light inside. The bed was made. The quilt was smooth. They had not gone to bed that night. The room had been tossed, but with a different kind of energy than the living room. This was not rage. This was a search. The dresser drawers were pulled out clothes, flung onto the floor. The closet doors were thrown wide. I walked into the walk-in closet where my father kept his safe. It was a heavy steel box bolted to the floor, the kind that was supposed to be impenetrable. The door of the safe was hanging open. It had not been cracked by a professional. The metal around the lock was twisted and scarred, bearing the marks of a crowbar and a sledgehammer. Someone had beaten it into submission. I looked inside. Empty. The cash box my father kept for emergencies was gone. The folders, containing the deeds to the land, the insurance policies, the birth certificates, all gone. Papers that had been deemed worthless were scattered across the carpet like fallen leaves. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my shock. If they were looking for money, they found it. But where were my parents? Where was Sarah? Sarah. I screamed her name, no longer caring who heard me. I spun around and sprinted down the hall to the room at the far end. Sarah's room. The door was closed. I grabbed the handle and shoved it open. The beam of my light swung wildly around the room. It was a scene of childish devastation. Sarah's room was a shrine to her innocence, filled with pink curtains and shelves of porcelain dolls. But now the dolls were swept off the shelves. Their fragile faces were cracked, staring up from the floor with dead, glassy eyes. Her bed was stripped to the mattress, halfway off the frame. "Sarah!" I choked out. The room was empty. The silence was absolute. I lowered the phone, despair washing over me. I was too late. I had come all this way, driven through the storm, only to find a house of horrors and no survivors. I turned to leave, my legs feeling like lead. Then I heard it creak. It was a tiny sound, barely a whisper. It came from the corner of the room. I froze. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it would crack bone. Hoo. It was the sound of breathing. But it was not normal breathing. It was wet, ragged, and terrified. It sounded like someone trying to breathe through a straw while crying. I slowly, agonizingly turned the light toward the corner. There was a built-in wardrobe there, used for storing extra blankets and Sarah's winter coats. The door was white, painted with small yellow flowers my mother had stenciled years ago. The door was not latched. It was open a fraction of an inch. Creak. The sound came again as the person inside shifted their weight. My hand shook so violently, the light danced on the wall. I took a step forward. "Sarah," I whispered, "is that you?" The breathing stopped abruptly. A high-pitched, stifled whimper escaped from the darkness behind the door. It was the sound a dog makes when it knows it is about to be kicked. I crossed the room in 3 strides. I reached out for the small crystal knob of the wardrobe door. The brass felt like ice against my palm. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, terrified of what I might see. What if it was not Sarah? What if it was the person who did this lying in wait? No, that whimper was Sarah. I knew it in my bones. I pulled the door open. The light flooded the small, cramped space. Huddled in the back corner, wedged between a stack of quilts and a hanging winter coat, was a pile of blankets. But the pile was shaking, violent, convulsive shudders that rattled the hangers above. I reached down and gently pulled back the top layer of the quilt. A pair of eyes stared up at me, wide, unblinking, bloodshot and ringed with dark bruises of exhaustion. "Sarah," I breathed, falling to my knees. She did not move. She was curled into a fetal ball, her knees pressed tight against her chest. Her hair was a matted mess, sticking to her forehead with sweat and grime. She looked like she had aged 10 years in a week, yet she also looked smaller, more fragile than I had ever seen her. "It is me," I said, my voice cracking. "It is James. I am here, you are safe." She did not speak. She did. Sarah had a vocabulary of a 5-year-old, but when she was scared, she often went mute. Now she looked past me, her eyes darting to the open door of her bedroom, then back to me, filled with a terror so raw it hurt to look at. She let out a low moan, a sound of pure anguish, and uncurled one hand from her chest. Her fingers were white, gripping something so tightly, her knuckles were translucent. "Sarah, honey, you have to talk to me," I pleaded. "Where are Mom and Dad? Where is Kevin?" At the mention of the names, she flinched as if I had slapped her. She shook her head frantically back and forth, tears finally spilling over her eyelids and tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. She could not speak. The trauma had locked her voice away in a box she could not open. Instead, she raised her trembling hand. She pointed a shaking finger past me toward the window on the far side of the room. The blinds were drawn, but I knew what was out there. The backyard, the old oak tree, and beyond that, the machine shed and the barn. She stabbed her finger in the air toward the window, her mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. "There! There! There!" Then she thrust her other hand toward me, the hand that was clenching the object. I gently pried her fingers open. They were stiff, resistant, but eventually they gave way. In her palm lay a crumpled, sweaty ball of paper. I took it and smoothed it out on my knee, keeping the light trained on it. It was a piece of lined notebook paper, torn from a spiral notebook. It was wrinkled and stained, but the writing was legible. It was scrawled in black marker, the letters jagged and rushed. I read the words and the blood in my veins turned to ice water. It was not a suicide note. It was not a ransom note. It was something far worse. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my flesh through my coat. She pulled me closer, her face inches from mine, and let out a sound that was half gasp, half word. Monster," she croaked, her voice sounding like grinding stones. "Monster home." She pointed at the window again. I looked at the paper in my hand, then at the window, and finally back at my sister, who was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. The horror of the empty house was nothing compared to the horror of what she was trying to tell me. The silence was over. The screaming was about to begin. I gently placed the flashlight on the floor, the beam pointing upward and casting long, distorted shadows against the ceiling of the closet. The air in the small space was thick with the scent of unwashed skin and old urine. It was the smell of neglect, sharp and ammonia-heavy, and it broke my heart more than the sight of the blood downstairs. Sarah was 25 years old, a grown woman by all physical accounts. But as I reached out to her, she shrank back like a terrified child, pulling her knees up to her chin. "It is okay, Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm going to pick you up now. We are getting out of here." She did not resist, but she did not help either. She was dead weight. As I slid my arms under her legs and behind her back, I was shocked by how light she was. She felt hollow, like a bird made of hollow bones and feathers. Through her thin nightgown, I could feel the sharp ridge of her spine and the jutting angles of her ribs. She had not eaten in days, maybe a week. The realization made a wave of nausea roll through me. My parents would never let this happen. The only way Sarah ends up in this state is if Thomas and Martha are not there to stop it. I lifted her out of the closet. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, her body rigid. She was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered against my collarbone. I carried her over to her bed, but when I tried to set her down, she let out a high-pitched keen and dug her fingers into my coat. "No, no," she wailed, the sound muffled against my chest. "Monster!" Monster came back. "The monster is gone," I lied, stroking her matted hair. "I am here. James is here." I sat on the edge of the mattress, keeping her on my lap as if she were a toddler. I needed to get fluids into her. I remembered the water bottle I had packed in my bag downstairs, but I could not leave her alone. I scanned the room and saw a half-empty glass of water on her nightstand. It was dusty, but it was liquid. I reached for it and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and soaking the front of her gown. She coughed, choking on the liquid, but tried to drink more. I pulled the glass away gently. "Slow down," I murmured. "Slow down, sweetie." As her panic subsided slightly into a rhythmic whimpering, I looked at the crumpled paper she had pressed into my hand earlier. I had shoved it into my pocket when I lifted her. Now, with the flashlight beam cutting across the room, I pulled it out and smoothed it against my thigh. It was 2 pieces of paper stapled together. The top sheet was a formal notice from the bank. A second notice for an overdue payment on a loan I did not know existed. The sum was staggering, $50,000. My father did not believe in debt. He paid cash for everything. If he had taken out a loan, it meant he was desperate. But it was the second sheet that made my blood run cold. It was a piece of notebook paper torn from a spiral binding. The handwriting was jagged, aggressive, written in black Sharpie that had bled through the page. I knew that handwriting. I had seen it on birthday cards and failed report cards for my entire life. "Dad, I am done asking. I need the money by Friday. Sell the south pasture. I do not care about the cows. I do not care about the legacy. If you do not sign the transfer, these guys are going to take it out on me, and then I am going to bring them to you. Do not make me come back out there. Kevin." I stared at the name. Kevin, my brother. Kevin, the boy I had taught to ride a bike. The boy I had protected from bullies in elementary school. He had written this. He had threatened our parents. Do not make me come back out there. He had come back. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The smashed photos, the open safe, the terror in Sarah's eyes. It was not a stranger. It was not a random burglary. It was family. Sarah whimpered again, her grip on my arm tightening until her fingernails pierced my skin. "Kevin," I whispered. At the sound of his name, Sarah jerked in my arms. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "Kevin bad," she slurred the words thick with fear. "Kevin loud, hurt daddy head." I closed my eyes, fighting back the tears that burned hot and fast. "Okay, Sarah, okay. We are leaving. We are going to see Sheriff Miller." I stood up, hoisting her into my arms again. She was too weak to walk. I grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the floor and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering her head like a hood. We moved through the hallway past the empty bedroom of our parents and down the stairs. The house felt watching us, every shadow a potential threat. I kept expecting Kevin to jump out from the kitchen holding a weapon, that manic grin on his face. But the house remained silent, save for the wind rattling the loose front door. I carried her out into the storm. The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally. It stung my face like needles. I wrestled the passenger door of my Audi open and placed Sarah in the seat. I buckled her in her small frame, lost in the leather bucket seat. She stared straight ahead, catatonic. I ran to the driver's side, jumped in, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, the heater blasting warm air that felt like a blessing. I reversed out of the driveway, the tires spinning for a second before gripping the gravel beneath the snow. As we drove down the long, winding road that led away from the ranch, the headlights carved a tunnel through the white darkness. I glanced at Sarah. She was rocking back and forth, muttering to herself. "Not the woods," she whispered. "Not the woods. Not the woods." "We are just driving to town, Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "We have to go through the pass." The road to Stone Creek passed through a dense section of pine forest about a mile from our property line. It was an old-growth forest, the trees tall and thick, creating a canopy that blocked out the moon. As the car approached the tree line, Sarah's behavior changed instantly. She screamed. It was not a scream of pain, but of pure, unadulterated horror. She threw her hands up, covering her face, curling into a ball, as much as the seatbelt would allow. "Do not look!" she shrieked. "Do not look! They are in there sleeping. Sleeping in the dark." "Who is sleeping?" "Sarah." I asked, my heart racing. I slowed the car, peering into the dense wall of pine trees on my left. The headlights caught only the trunks of the trees and the swirling snow. "Is that where they are?" "Don't stop," she yelled, kicking the dashboard. Go, bad place, Daddy's sleeping." Her use of the word sleeping sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. In Sarah's mind, death and sleep were often confused. When our old dog died, she told everyone he was sleeping in the garden. I floored the accelerator. The car fishtailed slightly before straightening out. I drove like a madman, putting distance between us and that patch of forest. Whatever she had seen, or whatever she thought she had seen in those woods, I could not investigate it alone. Not with her in the car. I needed help. We reached the outskirts of Stone Creek 20 minutes later. The hospital was a small, one-story brick building that served the entire county. The emergency room entrance was lit by a flickering fluorescent sign. I pulled up to the curb and ran inside, shouting for help. 2 nurses rushed out with a wheelchair. We got Sarah inside. The warmth and the bright, sterile lights of the hospital seemed to calm her slightly. Or perhaps she was just exhausting her reserves of adrenaline. Dr. Evans, a man who had treated my broken arm when I was 12, came out of the examination room after 20 minutes. He looked older, his hair completely white, his face lined with fatigue. "James," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "It is good to see you, though. I wish it were under better circumstances." "How is she, Doc?" "She is severely dehydrated," Evans said, lowering his voice. "She has some bruising on her arms and legs consistent with bumping into things in the dark, but no broken bones. The main concern is the psychological trauma. She is in a state of acute shock. We have given her a sedative and hooked her up to an IV. She needs rest, James. A lot of rest." "Did she say anything?" I asked. "She kept muttering about a cold room and Kevin." Evans looked at me over his glasses. "James, what is going on out at the ranch? Where are Thomas and Martha?" Before I could answer, the automatic doors at the entrance slid open. A blast of cold air swirled into the waiting room, followed by a large figure, shaking snow off a heavy brown parka. It was Sheriff Miller. He looked exactly as I remembered him, perhaps, a bit heavier around the middle. He was a man of few words, a fixture in Stone Creek for 40 years. He took off his hat, slapping it against his thigh, to dislodge the snow, and walked over to me. "James," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Nurse called me. Said you brought Sarah in. Said she was in a bad way." "Sheriff," I nodded. I felt the exhaustion crashing down on me now that the adrenaline was fading. "You need to send someone out to the ranch. Right now." Miller narrowed his eyes. "Why, what happened? Whoa. My parents are gone," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "The house is destroyed. There is blood on the floor in the living room. The safe is blown open. And Sarah was hiding in her closet. She said—" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to say it. "She said Kevin did it." Miller did not look surprised. That was the most terrifying part. He did not gasp. He did not look shocked. He just let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed his hand over his face. "Kevin," Miller muttered. "I was afraid of that." "You knew," I demanded, my voice rising. "You knew something was wrong." "Not like this," Miller said, holding up a hand to calm me. "But Kevin has been back in town for about 10 days. He did not go out to the ranch right away. He was staying at the Motel 6 on the highway." "He told me he was in Las Vegas," I said. He was not alone, James. Miller continued, his eyes locking onto mine. He was seen driving around with two men, not locals, city types. One of them had ink up his neck. They were seen at the gas station, and old man Henderson saw them arguing with Kevin outside the bar last Tuesday. He said the men looked persuasive. Persuasive how? Like they were the kind of men you do not say no to, Miller said grimly. We had a report of a disturbance at the motel a few nights ago. Yelling. Something about a deadline. By the time my deputy got there, they were gone. We thought they skipped town. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled note Sarah had been holding. I handed it to the sheriff. He did not skip town, I said. He went home. Miller read the note. His jaw tightened. He read it again, then looked up at me. The pity in his eyes was harder to take than the anger. This is a demand for sale, Miller said, and the date, Friday. That was yesterday. Sarah pointed to the woods, I told him, my voice dropping to a whisper. On the drive here. We passed the pine forest near the property line. She started screaming. She said, Daddy is sleeping in there. She said, don't look. Miller's face went pale. He put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. I need to get a team out there, he said, his voice all business now. If Kevin is desperate enough to hurt his own family for money, and if he has got heavy hitters with him, this is not a domestic dispute anymore. It is a manhunt. I am coming with you, I said. No, Miller stated firmly. You stay here with your sister. She needs you. She is sedated, I argued. And that is my mother and father out there, Miller. If Kevin hurt them, I need to find them. And I know the property better than any of your deputies. Miller looked at me. He saw the architect from Seattle, the man in the expensive coat. But he also saw the boy who grew up tracking deer in those mountains. He saw the son who had just found his sister, half dead in a closet. Fine, Miller grunted. But you stay behind me, and if I tell you to duck, you kiss the dirt. Do you understand? I understand. One more thing, James, Miller said, pausing with his hand on the doorframe. You need to prepare yourself. If Kevin is involved with loan sharks and if they came all the way out here, they did not come to talk. And if Sarah saw something in those woods, he did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. I knew what he was thinking. I was thinking it too. I just could not bring myself to believe it. My brother was a screw-up. He was a liar. He was a thief, but a killer. Could the boy I shared a bunk bed with really watch our parents bleed and do nothing? The image of the blood on the living room floor flashed in my mind. The image of Sarah shaking in the closet. Let's go, I said. I followed the sheriff out into the snow. The night was black and the wind was howling like a wounded animal. Somewhere out there in the cold, my parents were waiting. And somewhere out there, my brother was running. I did not know which one I wanted to find first. The antiseptic smell of the hospital hallway clung to my clothes as I walked out into the biting cold of the parking lot. Leaving Sarah behind felt like abandoning a wounded animal, even though I knew she was safer in that sterile room with a dedicated deputy stationed outside her door than she would be anywhere near me. Sheriff Miller was waiting by his cruiser, the engine idling, puffing white clouds of exhaust into the night air. I climbed into the passenger seat, and the heavy silence of the car enveloped us. We did not speak on the drive back to the ranch. There was nothing left to say that the radio chatter of the dispatch did not cover. The road, which had been a tunnel of anxiety on my way in, now felt like a path to an execution ground. We were not racing to save anyone anymore. We were racing to find bodies. When we pulled up the long driveway, the scene had changed. My parents' home, once a beacon of isolation and privacy, was now a carnival of tragedy. Blue and red lights from 3 other patrol cars washed over the snow, creating a strobe effect that made the familiar landscape look alien and jagged. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, wrapping around the porch pillars like a festive decoration for a party no one wanted to attend. I stepped out of the car, and the reality of it hit me. This was a crime scene. My childhood home was case number, whatever it was. I followed Miller inside. The house was buzzing with activity. 2 deputies were photographing the living room, their flashes popping like lightning. Another was dusting the doorframe for prints. "Stay here," Miller told me, pointing to the kitchen archway. "Do not touch anything." I stood there, leaning against the wall, watching strangers dissect the wreckage of my family's life. My eyes drifted to the dent in the wall and the bloodstains on the floor. A forensic technician was kneeling there, scraping a sample into a plastic vial. "Type O," the technician muttered to Miller, holding up a rapid test strip. "Consistent with the male victim's medical records." My father. That was my father's blood. A wave of nausea rolled over me, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, simmering rage. I looked at the chaotic room, and my mind drifted back involuntarily to the past. It was a defense mechanism, I suppose. My brain was trying to find a reason, a root cause for this madness. It always came back to Kevin. I remembered the summer Kevin turned 18. He had taken my father's brand new pickup truck for a joyride without asking. He had been drinking. He took a turn too fast on the gravel road near the creek and wrapped the truck around a cottonwood tree. I remember the call coming in. I remember my father's face not red with anger, but pale with worry. He did not call the police. He did not let Kevin learn a hard lesson in a jail cell. Instead, Thomas Williams called a tow truck driver he played poker with and paid him $500 cash to haul the wreck away quietly. He claimed the truck had been stolen. He filed a false insurance report. And Kevin got a slap on the wrist and a new truck 6 months later. "He is just a boy, James," my mother had said when I argued that Kevin needed to face consequences. "He made a mistake. We do not ruin his life over a mistake." They spent their entire lives shielding him from the rain, never realizing they were drowning him in their protection. They taught him that rules were for other people. They taught him that no matter how big the mess, Mommy and Daddy would write a check and make it go away. But they could not write a check for this. I needed air. The sight of the blood was making the room spin. I turned and walked out the back door, stepping onto the porch that overlooked the backyard. The wind had died down slightly, but the cold was still vicious. I walked over to the large industrial trash bins my father kept near the garage. I do not know why I did it. Maybe it was a habit. Maybe I was looking for something normal in a world that had gone insane. Or maybe my architect's eye noticed something out of place. The lid of the recycling bin was propped open slightly by an overflowing cardboard box. I lifted the lid. Inside, amidst the usual empty milk cartons and newspapers, something caught my eye. It was a thick stack of paper crinkled and stained with coffee grounds. It looked official. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a contract, a land sale agreement. I held it up to the porch light, my hand shaking. It was a document prepared by a law firm in Denver I had never heard of. It outlined the sale of the entire Williams Ranch, 3,000 acres, the house, the livestock, the mineral rights for a price that was insultingly low. It was a fire sale price, a desperation price. I flipped to the last page. The signature line for seller was blank. My father had refused to sign. But it was what was on the paper that made my stomach drop. There was a muddy footprint stamped right across the middle of the contract. It was a distinct tread pattern, a series of concentric circles, and a jagged lightning bolt logo in the heel. I knew that tread. Last Christmas, Kevin had begged for a pair of limited edition designer sneakers. They cost $400. My father grumbled, but bought them. I remembered Kevin showing them off, pointing out the unique sole design that was supposed to help with grip on the basketball court he never used. It was a size 11, Kevin's size. He had stood here. He had held this contract. And when our father refused to sign, Kevin had stomped on it in a fit of rage, or perhaps during a struggle, and then thrown it in the trash. It was the footprint of a tantrum that had turned into a massacre. "Sheriff!" I yelled. Miller came out onto the porch, his face grim. I handed him the contract. "He tried to make them sell," I said, my voice flat. "This is it. This is the motive. He needed the money fast." Miller examined the paper, then bagging it in an evidence pouch. "We just got a hit," he said, looking at me with serious eyes. "Your mother's credit card." "Where?" "A gas station in Fort Collins, about 50 miles east of here. The transaction was 3 days ago." "3 days," I repeated. "That means they were alive 3 days ago, or at least Kevin was." "Come inside," Miller said. "I want you to see something." We went back into the kitchen where a deputy had set up a laptop on the table. He was streaming video footage that had been emailed from the gas station's security system. "Watch this," Miller said, pointing to the screen. The video was grainy, time-stamped 11:15 at night 3 days prior. A black SUV pulled up to the pump. It was not my parents' truck. It was a late-model luxury car, the kind driven by city executives or high-level drug dealers. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was huge. Even on the small screen, he looked like a wall of muscle. He wore a tight t-shirt despite the cold, revealing sleeves of tattoos that ran all the way down to his knuckles. He had a shaved head and a beard that hid most of his face. "That is Randall," Miller said. State police identified him. Randall Jenkins. He is an enforcer for a loan shark ring operating out of Denver. Bad news. He has done time for assault with a deadly weapon and extortion. Then the passenger door opened. My breath hitched in my throat. It was Kevin. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same jacket he had on in his Facebook profile picture from 6 months ago, but it hung loosely on his frame. His hair was a mess. He was pacing back and forth while Randall pumped the gas. Kevin's hands were moving wildly, gesturing, pulling at his hair. He looked like a trapped animal. At one point in the video, Kevin turned toward Randall and seemed to be pleading with him. Randall just ignored him, finished pumping the gas, and then grabbed Kevin by the back of the neck. It was not a friendly gesture. It was a dominance move. He shoved Kevin back toward the car. Kevin stumbled, almost falling, before scrambling into the passenger seat. "He is not running the show," I whispered. "He is scared." "He is in deep," Miller agreed. "He owes these guys big money, James. The kind of money you do not pay back with a minimum wage job. He brought them here to liquidate the only asset he has access to, the ranch." "He brought wolves to the door," I said, staring at the frozen image of my brother's terrified face. "And when Dad said no, Randall likely took over," Miller finished the thought for me. The realization settled over me like a shroud. Kevin was a coward. He was selfish and greedy, but he was not a killer, not on his own, but he was weak. And weak men do terrible things when they are cornered by dangerous men. He had led these monsters into our living room thinking he could control the situation, thinking he could just scare Mom and Dad into signing. But you do not control men like Randall. I walked away from the laptop, needing to move. I wandered back into the living room. The deputies had finished photographing the main area and were moving toward the hallway. I found myself standing near the sofa. It was a large, overstuffed leather couch where my father used to fall asleep watching football on Sundays. It had been pushed askew, sliding a few feet from its original position, scraping the rug. I knelt down. Underneath the sofa, deep in the shadows against the skirting board, there was a faint glint of metallic blue. I reached under, and my fingers brushed against cold glass. I pulled it out. It was a smartphone, my mother's phone. It was in a floral case Sarah had bought her for Mother's Day 2 years ago. The screen was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, but when I pressed the side button, it flickered to life. The battery was at 4%. "Miller," I called out, not looking up. The sheriff was by my side in seconds. "It is Mom's," I said. "It was under the couch, like she dropped it or kicked it under there to hide it." There was no passcode. My mother could never remember them, so she never used one. I swiped the screen. It opened to her messaging app. There was an unsent message in the draft box. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the phone again. I read the words and I felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces. "Kevin, please don't do this. We can find another way. Please tell that man to leave. Sarah is upstairs." "Oh, God!" I choked out. The timestamp on the draft was 7 days ago, the night the silence began. "She knew," I whispered. "She was texting him. He was standing right here, probably shouting at Dad, and she was trying to text him to stop. She was begging him." "Read the last part again," Miller said softly. "Sarah is upstairs," I read. It was not just a plea. It was a warning. She was telling Kevin that his sister was in the house. She was trying to protect Sarah, even as the violence was unfolding. And that meant something else. "Kevin knew," I said, looking up at Miller, my eyes burning. "He knew Sarah was in the house. He got this text, or he saw her, or Mom told him. He knew she was hiding in that closet. And he left her there," Miller said, his voice hard as granite. "He left her," I said, the anger rising up and choking the grief. "He came here with a monster. They beat my father. They took my mother. And he left his disabled sister to starve to death in a closet because he was too busy trying to save his own skin." The picture was complete now. It was not a puzzle anymore. It was a tragedy written in blood and cowardice. Kevin had brought the devil home for dinner, and when the bill came due, he had fed our parents to him. "We have to find them," I said, standing up. "If they were alive 3 days ago, maybe they are still holding them. Maybe they are trying to force a signature." "We will find them," Miller said. "I am putting out an APB on that SUV. We have the plate number now from the video. We will find them, James." "I hope we do," I said, looking at the smashed photos of my face on the floor. "Because if we do not find them soon, I am going to find Kevin. And I am not sure I will be able to stop myself from doing what Dad should have done 18 years ago." The house groaned in the wind, a sound of mourning for the family that had been shattered within its walls. I clutched my mother's phone in my hand, the last lifeline to a woman who had died, trying to save her children, one from the monsters outside, and one from the monster within himself. Sheriff Miller was a good man, a methodical man, but methodical men follow procedures. Procedures take time, and time was the one luxury my parents did not have. While Miller was on the radio coordinating a grid search of the county and putting out an alert for the black SUV, I slipped away. I knew something Miller did not. I knew the ecosystem of failure that Kevin inhabited. If Kevin was hiding, he would not be in the woods. He was too soft for the cold. He would go where he always went when the world got too heavy and his pockets were light. He would go to the bottom of the bottle. I drove my Audi back into the heart of Stone Creek, the engine growling in the silent, snowy streets. I pulled up to the Rusty Spur. It was a dive bar on the wrong side of the tracks, a place where the floor was permanently sticky with spilled lager, and the air hung heavy with the smell of despair and cheap tobacco. This was where Kevin held court. This was where he bought rounds for strangers when he was flush with cash he had stolen from our mother's purse, playing the big shot for a crowd of losers who would forget his name the moment the tab ran out. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The heat hit me first, a wall of body odor and frying grease. The jukebox was playing a low, mournful country song about trucks and heartbreak. Every head in the bar turned to look at me. I stood out like a sore thumb in my tailored Seattle coat and designer boots. I was not one of them. I was the one who got away, and they hated me for it. I scanned the room. I did not see Kevin, but I saw Travis. Travis was a high school dropout who had been Kevin's shadow for 15 years. He was sitting at a corner booth, nursing a beer that looked warm. I walked over my boots loud on the wooden floorboards. Travis looked up, his eyes narrowing. "James, that you—" "Where is he, Travis?" I asked, cutting straight to the chase. "I do not know who you are talking about," Travis sneered, looking away. "And even if I did, I do not talk to sellouts." I reached into my wallet and pulled out a stack of bills. I did not count it. It was probably $500 or $600. I slammed the cash down on the sticky table, right next to his beer. The sound of the money hitting the wood cut through the noise of the bar. "My parents are missing," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "There is blood in the house. Sarah was left to die in a closet. If you do not tell me where Kevin is right now, I am going to assume you are an accessory to murder. And when Miller gets here, I will make sure he knows it." Travis looked at the money, then at my face. He saw something in my eyes that made him swallow hard. The bravado evaporated. He snatched the money and shoved it into his jacket pocket. "He is scared, James," Travis whispered, leaning in. "He came by yesterday, said he was in deep with some guys from the city, said he needed to lay low until the deal went through." "Where?" I demanded. "The Pinecone Motel," Travis said. "Room 104. It is out on the edge of town near the salvage yard. He is there with the big guy, the scary one." I did not say thank you. I turned on my heel and walked out, pulling my phone from my pocket. I dialed Miller. "I found him," I said as soon as he picked up. "James, where are you?" Miller's voice was sharp. "I told you to stay put." "Pinecone Motel, room 104. I am 5 minutes away. If you want to arrest him, you better meet me there because I am going in, whether you are there or not." I hung up before he could argue. The Pinecone Motel was a festering sore on the landscape of Stone Creek. It was a single-story strip of rooms with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed angrily, the letter M flickering on and off, like a dying heartbeat. The parking lot was empty, except for the black SUV. It was parked haphazardly, taking up 2 spaces in front of room 104. I parked my car across the street, killing the lights. 2 minutes later, Miller's cruiser slid silently into the lot, no sirens, just the crunch of tires on snow. He pulled up right behind the SUV, blocking it in. Miller got out his service weapon, drawn. He looked at me and signaled for me to stay back, but I was already moving. I had a tire iron in my hand that I had grabbed from my trunk. I was not a cop, I was a furious son. We approached the door. I could hear voices inside, shouty, angry voices. Then the sound of glass breaking. Miller did not knock. He kicked the door just below the handle. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the door swung inward, banging against the wall. "Sheriff's Department, show me your hands!" Miller roared, stepping into the room. The room was a sty. Pizza boxes were scattered on the floor, mixed with empty beer cans and clothes. The air was thick with the chemical tang of methamphetamine smoke. Kevin was sitting on the edge of the bed, shirtless, his ribs showing through his pale skin. He looked like a skeleton that had been reanimated by electricity. His eyes were wide pupils, blown so large they were almost entirely black. Standing near the window was Randall, the giant from the video. Randall did not freeze. He moved. He reached for his waistband, his face twisting into a snarl. "Don't do it," Miller shouted. Randall pulled a gun. It was a small silver pistol. Miller did not hesitate. He fired a single shot. It was deafening in the small room. The bullet hit the wall, inches from Randall's head, showering him with plaster dust. It was a warning shot, a miracle of restraint. Randall flinched, ducking, and in that split second Miller was on him. The sheriff, despite his age and bulk, moved with the force of a linebacker. He slammed Randall into the wall, pinning his arm. The pistol clattered to the floor. Miller swept Randall's legs out from under him, driving his face into the filthy carpet. "Stay down." Miller yelled, grinding his knee into Randall's back, while he reached for his cuffs. I did not look at Randall. My eyes were locked on Kevin. Kevin had not moved. He was staring at the gun on the floor, trembling. He looked up and saw me. A twisted, sick smile spread across his face. "Jamesy," he giggled. The sound was high and brittle. "You came back. Look at you, Mr. Architect." I dropped the tire iron. It hit the floor with a heavy clang. I crossed the room in 2 strides. I grabbed Kevin by his throat and hauled him off the bed. I slammed him against the wall, my forearm pressing into his windpipe. "Where are they?" I screamed, spit flying from my mouth. "Where are Mom and Dad?" Kevin clawed at my arm, his strength pathetic compared to my rage. He was laughing and coughing at the same time. "Get off me," he wheezed. "You are hurting me." "I will kill you," I said. And in that moment, I meant it. "I will kill you right here, if you do not tell me where they are." "James, back off," Miller shouted from the floor, struggling to keep Randall subdued. "Let me handle him." "No," I yelled back, not taking my eyes off my brother. "He is mine." "Where are they, Kevin? We found the blood. We found Sarah. Did you kill them? Did you let this animal kill them?" I gestured toward Randall. Kevin's face crumpled. The drugs were fighting with the fear, making his emotions swing wildly. 1 second, he was laughing, the next, he was sobbing. "It is your fault," Kevin screamed, spittle landing on my cheek. "You left. You ran away to your fancy city and your glass tower. You left me here to rot in this hole. They looked at me every day and saw you. Why can't you be like James? Why can't you be smart like James?" "Where are they?" I tightened my grip. "They wouldn't give me the money," Kevin sobbed, his body going limp in my grasp. "I needed it. Randall said he was going to break my legs. He said he was going to cut me. I asked Dad. I begged him. He has millions in land, millions. And he wouldn't give me $50,000 to save my life. He said I had to learn. He said no more bailouts." "So you killed him," I roared. "No," Kevin shrieked. "No, I didn't. I just wanted to scare them. I just wanted them to see I was serious. I told Randall we could just hold them for a few days, make them sign the papers. Where—" I shook him, his head banging against the drywall. "Where did you put them?" "The cellar," Kevin cried out. "The old hay cellar behind the hill. I locked them in." I just locked them in. The room went silent. Even Randall stopped struggling. The old hay cellar. My blood ran cold. The hay cellar was a concrete bunker dug into the side of the North Hill. We used it to store feed in the winter, but we had stopped using it 10 years ago because the roof was unstable, and it flooded. It was damp, dark, and freezing. It was essentially a refrigerator. When I asked, my voice barely a whisper, "When did you put them in there?" "Tuesday," Kevin whimpered. "Tuesday night." I did the math in my head. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Today was Tuesday. 7 days. They had been in a concrete box with no heat in the middle of a blizzard for a week. "Did you give them food?" I asked. "Did you give them water?" Kevin looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I was going to. But then, Dad got hurt when Randall hit him. And Randall said we couldn't go back. He said if we went back, they would call the cops. He said we had to wait until they got desperate enough to sign. "You left them to die," I said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. I let go of him. Kevin slid down the wall, curling into a ball on the floor, sobbing into his hands. He looked like a child again, but I felt no pity. I felt only a cold, hard resolve. "Get up," Miller said to Randall, hauling the big man to his feet and shoving him toward the door. "Deputy, get in here." 2 deputies rushed in, taking custody of Randall and Kevin. Kevin looked at me as they dragged him out. "James," he pleaded, "I didn't mean for it to happen. You have to believe me. It was just supposed to be a scare." I watched him go. I watched the brother I had once loved, the boy I had protected, being dragged away in handcuffs. He was right about one thing. He had been scared, but his fear was selfish. He was scared of pain, so he inflicted it on the people who loved him most. Miller walked over to me. He put a hand on my shoulder. "The hay cellar," Miller said. "It is 5 miles from the main house. The roads are blocked with snow. We can't get a cruiser up there." "I have the Audi," I said. "It has 4-wheel drive, but it won't make it up the goat path." "We need the snowmobiles," Miller said. "My deputies have them on the trailer. Let's go." "Miller," I said, grabbing his arm before we left the room. 7 days, in this cold, without water." Miller looked at me, Dad. He did not offer false hope. He did not tell me it would be okay. He was a rancher, too. He knew what the cold did to the human body. He knew that a week without water was a death sentence. "We go find them, James," Miller said. "That is all we can do. We go bring them home." We ran out to the parking lot. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was still whipping across the plains, sharp enough to cut skin. I looked toward the mountains, toward the darkness where my parents were trapped. "I didn't kill them," Kevin had said. Technically, he might be right. He didn't pull a trigger. He didn't wield a knife. He just locked a door and walked away. He let the cold and the thirst do the work for him. As I climbed into Miller's truck to head back to the ranch, I realized that was worse. A bullet is quick. Mercy is quick. What Kevin had done was a slow, agonizing torture. He had left them in the dark to listen to each other die. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. Please let them be alive. Please let me be wrong. But as we sped into the night, the image of the moldy food on the kitchen table haunted me. Life had stopped in that house 7 days ago. I was terrified that life had stopped in the cellar too. The journey from the motel back to the ranch was a blur of flashing lights and the roar of engines. But the final leg of the trip was a chaotic scramble against the elements. The black SUV and the patrol cars could only make it as far as the main driveway. The old hay cellar was located past the north ridge, tucked into the side of a limestone hill, about a half-mile from the main house. The snowdrifts there were waist-deep, untracked, and treacherous. Sheriff Miller did not wait for the snowmobiles to be unloaded. We set out on foot, a small army of deputies, and flashlights cutting through the darkness, trudging through the heavy powder. The wind had picked up again, screaming across the open pasture, stinging my face, with ice crystals that felt like ground glass. My lungs burned with every breath of the freezing air, but I did not feel the fatigue. I was running on a cocktail of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated terror. The hay cellar was a relic of my grandfather's time. It was a dugout, essentially a man-made cave, reinforced with timber and stone, designed to keep feed dry and cool before modern barns made it obsolete. We hadn't used it in 20 years. As a child, I had been terrified of it. It was a place of spiders' darkness and the smell of damp earth. Now it was a prison. We crested the hill and the structure loomed out of the dark. It looked like a tomb entrance, a dark maw set into the white hillside. The heavy wooden door, weathered gray by decades of storms, was shut tight. As we scrambled down the slope, sliding in the snow, the beam of my flashlight hit the latch. There was a padlock on it. It was not a rusty old lock that had been there since the 90s. It was brand new. The shackle gleamed silver in the harsh light, a stark, sickening contrast to the rotting wood of the door. It was a master lock, heavy duty, the kind you buy at the hardware store when you want to protect something valuable or hide something terrible. "Stand back!" Miller shouted, his voice whipped away by the wind. I did not stand back. I couldn't. I was already at the door, grabbing the heavy iron hasp. It rattled, solid and unforgiving. "Give me the bar," I yelled, reaching out my hand without looking back. One of the deputies slapped a red steel crowbar into my palm. The metal was so cold it burned my glove. I jammed the flat end of the crowbar between the padlock and the hasp. I didn't just pry it. I threw my entire body weight against it, channeling every ounce of rage and fear into the motion. I screamed as I pushed a primal sound that tore at my throat. There was a groan of stressing metal, a sharp ping, and then the wood of the doorframe splintered. The hasp ripped free screws, and all flying into the snow. The door swung inward with a shriek of rusted hinges that sounded like a dying animal. I dropped the crowbar and lunged into the opening. The smell hit me before I even crossed the threshold. It was a physical wall of stench. It was the smell of damp, rotting straw, mixed with the sharp ammonia of human waste and the metallic tang of something else, something darker. It was the smell of a cage where animals had been kept too long. It made me gag, retching violently, but I forced myself forward. "Dad, Mom!" I roared into the dark. Miller and the deputies crowded in behind me, their tactical lights flooding the space. The cellar was long and narrow, the stone walls dripping with condensation. The floor was packed dirt, frozen hard as concrete. The beams of light swept across the darkness and landed on the far wall. My knees gave out. I didn't fall. I collapsed, hitting the dirt with a thud that I didn't even feel. They were there. In the center of the room, two thick wooden support posts rose from the floor to the ceiling. My parents were tied to them. They were sitting on the ground, back to back, separated by about 5 feet. Their hands were bound behind the posts with thick, yellow nylon rope, cattle rope. Their ankles were lashed together. "Dad," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. I scrambled on my hands and knees toward my father. Thomas Williams, the strongest man I had ever known, the man who could lift a calf over a fence and stare down a blizzard, was slumped forward. His chin was resting on his chest. He was wearing his flannel work shirt and a heavy vest, but he had no hat. I reached him. I grabbed his shoulders. They were stiff. "Dad, wake up. I am here. It is James." I pulled him back, forcing him to look at me. His eyes were open. They were staring straight ahead, fixed on a point in the darkness that I could not see. They were cloudy, glazed over with a film of ice. His skin was the color of blue clay. His mouth was slightly open, frozen in a silent gasp. He was cold. Not just the cold of the skin, but the deep, radiating cold of an object that has ceased to generate heat for a long time. I stared at his face, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Then, the light from Miller's flashlight cut across my father's temple. There was a gash on the side of his head. It was dark, crusted with dried blood that had matted his gray hair. It wasn't a fresh wound. It had stopped bleeding days ago. The skin around it was swollen and purple. This was where Randall had hit him. This was the blow Kevin had mentioned. A concussion, maybe a brain bleed. He had sat here, tied to a post in the freezing dark, slowly dying from a head injury, while his son waited in a motel room for a check. "He is gone, James," Miller said. His voice was gentle, but it sounded like a hammer blow. "Don't touch the crime scene." "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, he is just cold. He is just cold." Then, from the other post came a sound. It was faint, like the rustle of dry leaves. "Who?" I spun around. My mother. Martha was slumped to the side, her head resting against the rough wood of the post. Her eyes were closed. She looked impossibly small, like a bundle of rags. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, parched from days of dehydration. Her skin was waxy and pale, but as the light hit her face, her eyelids fluttered. "Mom." I scrambled over to her, sliding on the frozen dirt. I ripped the gloves off my hands. I touched her cheek. It was ice cold, but there was a faint, thready pulse in her neck. She was alive. Barely. She was in the final stages of hypothermia, her body shutting down, preserving the last flickers of heat for her core. "Knife!" I screamed at the deputies. "Give me a knife!" Miller was already there. He produced a serrated tactical knife and slashed through the yellow ropes binding her wrists. Her arms fell to her sides, limp and heavy. The circulation had been cut off for so long her hands were swollen and purple. I gathered her into my arms. She was lighter than Sarah had been. The smell of urine and sickness was overpowering, but I pulled her close, trying to transfer whatever heat I had in my own body into hers. "Mom, it is me. It is James. I have got you." Her head lolled back against my shoulder. Her eyes opened. They were unfocused, swimming in a haze of delirium. She looked up at the ceiling, then her gaze drifted down, trying to find my face. She blinked once, twice. Her lips moved. No sound came out. "Water," I said to the deputies. "Get the medics down here now." "They are coming," Miller said, speaking into his radio with urgent, clipped tones. "ETA 2 minutes. My mother's hand twitched. She was trying to lift it. She was trying to grab my coat. I took her frozen hand in mine and squeezed it. "You are safe, Mom. Dad is—" I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell her. "We are going to get you out of here." She drew in a breath. It rattled in her chest, a wet, sickly sound. She focused on me, and for a second, there was a spark of recognition. But it wasn't relief I saw in her eyes. It was panic. "Sarah," she whispered. The voice was a ghost, a dry rasp that sounded like tearing paper. "Sarah is safe," I promised. Tears streaming down my face, freezing on my cheeks. "I found her. She is at the hospital. She is safe." My mother did not seem to hear me. Her mind was stuck in a loop, trapped in the moment she was dragged out of her house. She squeezed my hand with a surprising, desperate strength. "Save Sarah," she wheezed. "She is in the closet." "I know, Mom, I know. I got her out." "Don't let him." Her eyes rolled back in her head. The tension in her body snapped, and she went completely limp in my arms. "Mom, Mom!" I shook her gently. "Stay with me, Martha." "She is crashing," a voice yelled from the doorway. A team of paramedics burst into the cellar, carrying trauma bags and a stretcher. They swarmed around us, pushing me back. I fought them for a second, not wanting to let go, but Miller grabbed me by the shoulders and hauled me away. "Let them work, James. Let them work." I stood with my back against the damp stone wall, watching them cut off her clothes, watching them attach leads to her chest, watching them pump warmed fluids into her veins. "No radial pulse," one medic shouted. "My heart rate is 40 and dropping. We need to move her." Now, they lifted her onto the backboard. She looked like a broken doll. They strapped her down and ran with her out the door into the snow. I made to follow them, but I stopped. I looked back at the other post. My father was still sitting there, alone. The coroner had not arrived yet. The deputies were standing around him, respectful but distant. One of them had draped a jacket over his head to cover the stare. I walked over to him. I knelt down in the dirt. I reached out and touched his hand. It was a rough hand calloused from 50 years of ranch work. It was the hand that had taught me to throw a lasso, the hand that had signed my report cards, the hand that had struck the table in anger when I said I was leaving for Seattle. I squeezed it. It was hard and unyielding. "I am sorry, Dad," I whispered. "I am so sorry I wasn't here." I stayed there until the coroner arrived with the body bag. I watched them cut him down. I watched them zip the black plastic over his face. When I finally walked out of the cellar, the storm had broken. The wind had died, and the snow fell straight down in large, soft flakes. The ambulance carrying my mother was already gone, its taillights fading down the road. The coroner's van was backing up to the hill. I stood in the snow, shivering violently. My coat was stained with the filth of the cellar and the dampness of the floor. Sheriff Miller walked up to me. He looked 10 years older than he had an hour ago. He held out a thermos of coffee, but I shook my head. "The medical examiner did a preliminary check on Thomas," Miller said quietly. "He didn't freeze to death, James." I looked at him, waiting for the words I knew were coming. "It was the head wound," Miller said. "Subdural hematoma. If he had gotten to a hospital on Tuesday, maybe even Wednesday, he would have made it. But sitting in the cold with no water to keep his blood pressure up, Miller didn't finish. He didn't have to. My father hadn't died instantly. He had died slowly. He had sat there tied to that post, feeling his mind slip away, watching his wife suffer across from him, unable to help her. 5 days. Kevin had said he locked them in on Tuesday. Today was Tuesday. 5 days of darkness. 5 days of listening to the wind howl against the door. 5 days of wondering if their favorite son was going to come back and save them, or if he was the one who had condemned them to this hell. I looked at the new padlock lying in the snow where I had thrown it. It was shiny and clean. Kevin hadn't killed them with a gun. He had killed them with a padlock and a lack of spine. He had killed them by driving away and waiting for a signature that would never come. I looked up at the sky. The silence of the ranch was back, but it wasn't the silence of peace anymore. It was the silence of a grave. And I knew, standing there, in the wreckage of my family, that the silence would never truly leave me again. The interrogation room at the Stone Creek Sheriff's Department was painted a color that I can only describe as institutional despair. It was a pale, peeling green, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes that sucked the warmth out of anyone sitting beneath them. I stood on the other side of the one-way mirror, my hands pressed against the cold glass, watching the disintegration of my family's history. Sheriff Miller had separated them. Randall Jenkins was in interview room 1. Kevin was in interview room 2. The strategy was the oldest one in the book, The Prisoner's Dilemma. Isolate them, lie to them about what the other one is saying, and wait for the first rat to jump ship. It did not take long. I watched Randall first. He sat with a terrifying stillness, his handcuffed hands resting on the metal table. He was a professional. He knew the system. He knew that in a capital murder case, the first one to cut a deal lives. I was just the muscle, Randall said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The audio fed into the observation room with a tinny, metallic quality. The kid hired me for protection. He said he needed to have a conversation with his parents about an inheritance dispute. He told me it would be easy, in and out. "You assaulted Thomas Williams," Miller said. Miller was seated across from him, looking exhausted, but focused. "We have the forensic evidence." "I restrained him," Randall corrected smoothly. "The old man came at me with a fire poker. I disarmed him. That is self-defense. But I did not kill him. And I sure as hell did not lock that door." "Who locked the door, Randall?" Randall leaned forward, a shark smelling blood in the water. "The kid did. And here's the thing, Sheriff. I told him to let them go. When the old man fell after the kid pushed him, I said we had to call an ambulance." My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my forehead against the glass. "Kevin pushed him?" Miller asked. "Yeah," Randall nodded. "The old man refused to open the safe. He spit in Kevin's face. Kevin lost it. He shoved his father. Hard. The old man went back and hit his head on the door frame. He went down like a sack of cement. That is when the bleeding started. I checked him. He was out cold. I told Kevin we had to bail. But Kevin got this look in his eye. He said if we called the cops, he goes to jail for assault. He said he needed time. So he locked them in the cellar." "He grabbed the padlock from the tool shed," Randall said. "He dragged them in there. I helped carry the woman, I admit that. But it was Kevin who snapped the lock shut. He said, let them think about it for a night." One night turned into a week. I wanted to leave, but he owed my boss $50,000. I couldn't leave without the money. I turned away from the window bile rising in my throat. Randall was a monster, but he was a logical monster. He was minimizing his role, shifting the capital charge to Kevin. And the worst part was, I believed him. Kevin's temper was legendary. He was a coward, and cowards lash out when they are humiliated. I walked down the hallway to the observation room for interview room 2. Kevin looked like a child wearing a man's skin. He was hunched over the table, shaking violently. He had been crying for hours. His nose was running, his eyes were swollen shut. He did not look like a killer. He looked like a victim, but I knew better now. Miller walked in and sat down. He slammed a file folder on the table. The noise made Kevin jump, nearly out of his skin. "Randall is talking, Kevin," Miller lied or told the partial truth. "He says it was all your idea. He says you pushed your father. He says you are the one who locked the door." "He is a liar," Kevin shrieked. "He made me do it. He had a gun." "Randall says you wanted the inheritance." Miller continued, his voice relentless. "He says you talked about how much easier it would be if they were gone." "No, I just wanted the loan paid off." "Then explain Sarah," Miller said. The room went deadly silent. Kevin froze. The sobbing stopped abruptly. He wiped his nose on his sleeve, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "What about her?" Kevin mumbled. "We found the text on your mother's phone," Miller said softly. "She told you Sarah was upstairs. Randall says he didn't know about the sister until later. He says you told him not to worry about her. Why did you say that, Kevin?" "I watched my brother's face. I saw the gears turning. I saw him weighing his options. He could claim ignorance, but the text message proved he knew. He could claim he forgot, but no one forgets a human being." "She is not like us," Kevin whispered. "What did you say?" Miller leaned in. "Sarah," Kevin said, his voice gaining a sudden defensive strength. "She is broken. She has the mind of a toddler. She is a burden, Sheriff." "You know she is. Mom and Dad spent their whole lives changing her diapers and spoon-feeding her. They wasted everything on her. Doctor's therapy money that should have been mine. Money that could have saved me." I felt a coldness spread through my chest that was deeper than the blizzard outside. This was it. The mask was off. This was not fear. This was resentment. Pure, distilled hatred that had been festering for 25 years. "So you left her in the closet," Miller said. "I was going to come back," Kevin protested, but it sounded hollow. "I figured if Mom and Dad were gone, I would have to take care of her. And I can't do that, Sheriff. I am not a nurse. I thought maybe it would be better if she just went with them." "Went with them?" Miller asked. "You mean died?" Kevin shrugged. It was a small, jerky motion, but it was the most damning gesture I had ever seen. "I thought about putting her in a home," Kevin rambled, talking fast now, trying to justify the unjustifiable. "A state facility. But that costs money. And if I got the ranch, I didn't want the state taking a lien on the property to pay for her care. So I thought if she just disappeared, if she starved, it would be a tragedy. Just a tragedy. And I would get the insurance, I would get the land, I would be free." I closed my eyes. I gripped the edge of the counter in the observation room so hard my fingernails dug into the wood. He had not just forgotten her in a panic. He had calculated her death. He had done the math. Sarah minus food equals 0 cost. Sarah minus life equals 100% profit. He had sat in that motel room for a week, eating pizza and watching TV, knowing his disabled sister was slowly dying of thirst in a dark closet, and he had rationalized it as a financial decision. Miller stood up. He looked down at Kevin with an expression of absolute disgust. "You are under arrest for 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder," Miller said. "And God have mercy on your soul, son, because the law certainly won't." I walked out of the police station before they brought him out. I could not breathe the same air as him. I drove to the hospital. It was 3 in the morning. The snow had stopped, leaving the world covered in a deceptive, pristine white blanket. I went straight to the intensive care unit. The doctors were working on my mother. They had been working on her for 6 hours. They called it rewarming shock. When a body is that cold for that long, warming it up causes the blood vessels to dilate too fast. The blood pressure plummets. The heart, already weakened, goes into chaos. I stood by the window of her room. She was hooked up to a dozen machines. A ventilator was breathing for her. Her skin was no longer blue. It was a translucent gray. At 4:15 in the morning, the alarm started beeping. It was a rhythmic, frantic sound. Doctors rushed in. Nurses pushed me out into the hallway. I watched through the glass doors. I saw them doing chest compressions. I saw the violent jerk of her body as they shocked her heart. Once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped. The lead doctor looked at the clock on the wall. He pulled off his gloves. She was gone. Martha Williams, the woman who had held the family together with Sunday phone calls and silent endurance, had died of multiple organ failure. She had survived the cold, but she could not survive the recovery. The doctor came out to see me. He looked defeated. "I am sorry, James," he said. Her heart just gave out. She was conscious for a moment right before the end. "Did she say anything?" I asked. "She whispered a name," the doctor said. "Sarah." That was all. I nodded. Even in death, her only thought was for the child who could not care for herself. She did not ask about Kevin. She did not ask about the ranch. She only asked for Sarah. I sat in the plastic chair in the waiting room as the sun began to rise over the mountains. I was now the patriarch of a dead family. My father was in the morgue. My mother was in the morgue. My brother was in a cell. And I was alone. Except I wasn't alone. I stood up and walked down the hall to the pediatric wing where they were keeping Sarah. She was 25, but given her mental state, they felt she would be safer there. The next few days were a blur of flashing cameras and microphones. The story had broken. The Stone Creek tragedy. The House of Silence. Satellite trucks from Denver, and even national networks were parked along the main street. They wanted the gruesome details. They wanted to know about the brother who killed for money. They wanted to interview the surviving architect's son. I gave them nothing. I hired a lawyer to keep them off the property. I focused entirely on Sarah. 3 days after the funeral, I went to visit Sarah in her room at the hospital. She was sitting up in bed looking small and fragile. The nurses had washed her hair and braided it. She was wearing clean pajamas. She was drawing. Art had always been Sarah's way of speaking. When she couldn't find the words, which was often, she would draw. "Hey, sweetie," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. She looked up at me. Her eyes were still haunted, but the terror was receding, replaced by a deep, confusing sadness. She didn't smile, but she pushed the paper toward me. "For James," she whispered. I looked at the drawing. It was done in crayon, pressing hard on the paper so the wax built up in thick layers. It was a picture of the living room. I recognized the fireplace and the big window. In the center of the room, there was a tall black stick figure. It had jagged lines radiating from it. In one hand, it held a brown stick, a bat or a club. On the floor were 2 other figures. One had a blue shirt, Dad. One had a dress, Mom. The black figure was standing over the blue figure, the brown stick raised high. Red crayon was scribbled furiously over the blue figure's head. But it was the detail in the corner that stopped my heart. On the far right of the paper, there was a vertical brown rectangle, a door. And peering out from a tiny crack in the rectangle was a very small figure with huge wide eyes. Tears were drawn on its face as blue dashes. This was not just a drawing. It was an eyewitness account. Sarah had seen it all. She hadn't just heard it. She had opened the closet door. She had watched Kevin, the black figure, strike our father. She had watched him drag them away. I held the paper with trembling hands. This was the nail in the coffin. Kevin's defense lawyer would try to argue that Randall did the hitting, that Kevin was just a scared accomplice. They would try to mitigate his sentence. But this drawing proved Kevin was the aggressor. Sarah saw him holding the weapon. Sarah saw him standing over Dad. "Did Kevin do this?" I asked, pointing to the black figure. Sarah nodded slowly. "Kevin hit Daddy. Daddy sleep. Kevin laugh." Kevin laughed. I carefully folded the drawing and placed it in my inside pocket. "You are a brave girl, Sarah," I said, kissing her on the forehead. "You just saved us. You just made sure the monster never comes back." I walked out of the hospital room and into the bright, harsh sunlight of the Colorado winter. I had a meeting with the district attorney in an hour. I was going to hand him this drawing. I was going to hand him my brother's life. And for the first time in a week, I felt a grim sense of peace. The silence in the house was gone, replaced by the roar of justice coming down the tracks. The funeral was scheduled for tomorrow. The house, which had been a crime scene only 48 hours ago, was now eerily quiet. The police tape was gone. The blood had been scrubbed from the floorboards by a professional cleaning crew, but I could still see the ghost of the stain every time I walked past the spot where my father had fallen. I was alone. Sarah was still at the hospital safe in the pediatric wing, where she colored pictures of horses and refused to speak to anyone but me. I had come back to the ranch to find a suit for my father to be buried in. It was a morbid task, sifting through the closet of a man whose life had been stolen, looking for the charcoal gray jacket he wore to church on Easter. I stood in the center of the master bedroom. It was cold. The heating had been fixed, but the chill in this room was metaphysical. It was the chill of absence. As I pulled the suit from the hanger, something caught my eye. It was the way the afternoon light hit the floorboards near the heavy oak dresser. The dust motes were dancing in the air, settling on everything except one specific patch of the rug. It looked disturbed. A memory flashed in my mind. It was from the night I found Sarah. When I had opened the closet door, she had been pointing. At the time, I thought she was pointing exclusively at the window, towards the barn, where our parents were being held. But now, replaying that moment in the silence of the room, I realized her finger had been trembling in a wider arc. She had pointed at the window, yes, but before that, she had pointed down. Right here, right at the foot of the bed. I dropped the suit on the mattress and knelt. I pulled back the heavy Persian rug that had covered this floor for 30 years. There was a loose floorboard. It wasn't obvious. The carpentry was excellent, but there was a tiny scratch mark on the wood as if someone had pried it up recently with a knife. I dug my fingernails into the gap and pulled. The board groaned and popped up. Underneath, resting in the insulation between the joists, was a thick manila envelope. It wasn't dusty. It had been placed there recently. I pulled it out. It was heavy. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a slow, rhythmic warning. This wasn't the deed to the ranch. I knew where the deed was. The bank had a copy. This was something else. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the clasp. Inside was a stack of documents, photocopies of bank transfers and printed emails. I began to read. The first page was a printout of a corporate structure for a company called Clearwater Holdings. It looked like a standard shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw the list of assets. They were buying up land all over Stone Creek, the Miller place to the south, the old Henderson farm. And they were trying to buy the Williams Ranch. But why? I turned the page and found a geological survey. My father had commissioned it secretly 6 months ago. The survey didn't show oil or gold. It showed water. A massive, untapped aquifer ran directly beneath our land. In a state like Colorado, where water rights were worth more than blood, this was a gold mine. But it wasn't just about water. The next document was a handwritten log by my father. November 12th, it read, "Track the deposit from Clearwater. It is not developer money. It is dirty. It is coming from a cartel account in Juarez, washed through a casino in Vegas and deposited here. They are using the land purchases to clean the cash. They overpay for the dirt, sell it cheap to a subsidiary, and the money comes out clean on the other side." My father hadn't just been a stubborn rancher refusing to sell his home. He had been an investigator. He had stumbled upon a massive money laundering operation happening right in his backyard. I flipped to the next page and the world stopped turning. It was a transfer deed for the Henderson farm, which had sold 2 months ago. The notary stamp on the bottom was familiar, but it was the signature of the legal representative for the buyer that made the breath freeze in my lungs. Arthur Harrison, Esquire. I stared at the name. The letters seemed to swim before my eyes. Arthur Harrison. Uncle. Art. He wasn't my blood uncle, but he might as well have been. He was my father's best friend. They had played football together in high school. Art was the family lawyer. He was the one who handled the wills. He was the one who gave me my first savings bond. He was the one who had sat in my living room 3 days ago crying, holding my hand, telling me he would do anything to help find Thomas and Martha. I frantically flipped through the rest of the file. It was all there. Harrison wasn't just the lawyer for the sale. He was the architect. He was the one setting up the shell companies. He was the one laundering the cartel's money through local real estate. And then I found the note about Kevin. It was a printout of an email from Harrison to a man named R.J., Randall Jenkins, subject, the weak link. Randall, the youngest son, is in deep. He owes $50,000 to the casino. I have bought the debt. Apply pressure. Tell him we will forgive the principal if he can convince the old man to sign the rights over. Use him. If Thomas won't sell for money, he will sell for his son's safety. I dropped the papers on the floor. It wasn't just Kevin. Kevin was a pawn. A stupid, desperate pawn. He hadn't gone to the loan sharks on his own. Harrison had bought his debt. Harrison, the man who brought candy to our house on Christmas Eve, had deliberately trapped Kevin in a financial vice. He knew Kevin was weak. He knew Kevin was the crack in my father's armor. Harrison had orchestrated everything. He had sent Randall. He had manipulated Kevin into coming here. He had weaponized my brother against my parents because my father had discovered the money laundering scheme and refused to be bought off. My father wasn't killed for being stubborn. He was killed because he was a whistleblower. And the man who ordered the hit was the man who was supposed to read the eulogy at his funeral tomorrow. A sound from downstairs shattered my paralysis. The front door opened. James! The voice was warm, familiar, booming with that false joviality that politicians and successful lawyers cultivate. James, you here, son? I saw your car. It was Harrison. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I looked at the papers scattered on the floor. I couldn't hide them all. There were too many. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. I brought over some paperwork for the coroner, Harrison called out, his voice getting closer. And Linda made you a lasagna. You need to eat, son. I stood up, backing away from the bed. I kicked the rug, trying to cover the hole in the floor, but the file was still lying open on the quilt. Harrison appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a black trench coat and a somber expression that vanished the moment his eyes landed on the bed. He saw the file. He saw the geological survey. He saw the printed emails. He stopped. The warmth drained from his face instantly. It was like watching a wax figure melt. The kindly Uncle Art disappeared, and in his place stood a cold, calculating stranger. He looked at the papers, then he looked at me. He didn't ask what they were. He knew. I told Thomas to burn that, Harrison said. His voice was no longer booming. It was quiet, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. I told him that curiosity killed the cat, but your father always did have a hero complex. You killed them, I said. My voice was shaking, but not with fear. With a rage so white-hot I could barely see. You set Kevin up. You sent Randall. Harrison sighed. He walked into the room, closing the door behind him. I didn't want them dead, James. That is the truth. I just wanted the signature. The aquifer under this land is worth $300 million over the next 20 years. $300 million. And your father wanted to keep grazing cows on it. He was your best friend, I spat. He was a liability, Harrison corrected. He found out about the laundering. He was going to go to the FBI. Do you have any idea what the people I work for would do to me if that happened? Randall is a choir boy compared to the men in Juarez. I had to stop him. So you used Kevin, I said. You used his gambling debt. Kevin was low-hanging fruit, Harrison said, stepping closer. I offered him a way out. I told him, get your dad to sign and the 50,000 vanishes. I didn't tell him about the water. I didn't tell him about the laundering. I just gave him a desperate need and a solution. I didn't think he would lock them in a cellar, James. That was all, Kevin. That boy always did lack imagination. I am going to the police, I said, my hands clenching into fists. I am going to Miller. I have the emails. I have the proof. Harrison smiled. It was a sad, pitying smile. No, you aren't, James. He reached into his coat pocket. I expected him to pull out a phone or a wallet. He pulled out a gun. It was a snub-nosed revolver, black and ugly. He held it casually pointed at my chest. I really am sorry about this, Harrison said. I liked you. I really did. I was hoping you would just sell the place and go back to Seattle. We could have handled the transfer quietly. But now, he gestured to the papers on the bed, now you are a liability too. You are going to shoot me, I asked, my voice rising. In my parents' house, with the police crawling all over this town. The police are gone, Harrison said calmly. Miller is busy processing Kevin, and accidents happen, James. A grieving son distraught over the murder of his parents. The betrayal of his brother's suicide is a very plausible narrative. I will wipe the prints off the gun. I will type a note on your computer. It will be tragic. The town will mourn you. My mind raced. I was 10 feet away from him. He had a gun. I had nothing. If I lunged, he would shoot. If I ran, he would shoot. I had to think. I was an architect. I solved problems. What was the variable here? You are too late, I lied. I forced myself to stand tall. I looked him dead in the eye. What? Harrison frowned. Harrison, I found these papers an hour ago, I said, keeping my voice steady. I didn't just read them. I took pictures. I emailed them to my firm in Seattle. I emailed them to Sheriff Miller. Harrison's eyes flickered. He hesitated. For a split second, doubt crept into his expression. You are lying, he said. The internet out here is garbage. You can barely get a signal. I used the satellite uplink, I countered. The one Dad installed for the business. It is fast. Check the router downstairs if you don't believe me. The files are gone, Art. If you shoot me, you just confirm everything. The FBI will be here by morning. It was a gamble. A massive, desperate gamble. The satellite internet had been down since the storm started. I hadn't sent anything. The phone in my pocket had 0 bars. Harrison stared at me. The gun didn't waver, but his knuckle turned white on the trigger. He was calculating. He was a lawyer. He dealt in risks. Was the risk of me lying greater than the risk of the emails being real? I don't believe you, Harrison whispered. But there was a tremor in his voice. Go ahead, I challenged him. Pull the trigger. But know that when you do, you are not killing a witness. You are killing a dead man walking. Because once those emails are opened, the cartel is going to come for you. And they won't be as quick as a bullet. Harrison's face twisted into a snarl. The mask of the friendly uncle was completely gone, replaced by the desperate cornered rat that he was. I will take my chances, he hissed. He raised the gun to eye level. He cocked the hammer. The click sounded like a thunderclap in the small room. He wasn't buying it. My bluff had failed. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the tension in his forearm. I saw the tightening of his finger. I saw the end of my life in the black hole of the barrel. I braced myself for the impact. I thought of Sarah. I thought of my parents freezing in the dark, and I realized with a sick clarity that I was about to join them. Goodbye, James, Harrison said, and then a shadow moved in the hallway behind him. The hammer of the revolver began to fall. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for the searing heat of a bullet that would end the Williams line forever. Then, a high-pitched scream shattered the air. "Bad man, go away!" It was not a warrior's war cry. It was the terrified shriek of a child. A blur of white flannel launched itself from the hallway. It was Sarah. I had brought her home from the hospital just 2 hours ago because she had been inconsolable in the sterile room screaming until her throat was raw. I thought she was asleep in the guest room down the hall, sedated and safe. I was wrong. She had been watching. She had been listening. And for the first time in her life, she was not hiding. In her hands, she clutched a heavy blue ceramic vase, my mother's favorite, the one she kept filled with dried lavender. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, Sarah hurled it. The vase did not hit Harrison with lethal force, but it struck him square in the temple. The ceramic shattered into a cloud of blue dust and shards. Harrison grunted in pain, stumbling sideways. His arm jerked. Bang! The gun went off. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Plaster exploded from the wall 6 inches to the left of my head, dusting my hair with white powder. Harrison was dazed, blood trickling down his face from a cut above his ear, but he was still holding the gun. He turned towards Sarah, his eyes wild with pain and fury. He began to raise the weapon toward my sister. The paralysis that had held me captive vanished. I did not think. I did not calculate. I became an animal protecting its pack. I lunged. I covered the 10 feet between us in a single heartbeat. I lowered my shoulder and slammed into Harrison's midsection, driving him back against the dresser. The air whooshed out of his lungs. We crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and coats. "Let go!" Harrison roared, trying to bring the gun around to shoot me in the gut. I grabbed his wrist with both hands. I slammed it against the hardwood floor. Once, twice, 3 times. I felt something crunch in his hand, maybe the gun handle, maybe his fingers, but he wouldn't drop it. He brought his knee up, catching me in the ribs, knocking the wind out of me. He rolled over, pinning me. He was heavy, desperate, and fueled by the panic of a man watching $300 million slip away. He jammed the barrel of the gun under my chin. "You should have just died," he screamed, spit flying onto my face. "Police, drop the weapon now." The voice was a thunderclap from the doorway. Sheriff Miller stood there, his service weapon leveled at Harrison's head. Behind him were 2 deputies with shotguns. Harrison froze. He looked at Miller, then at the gun under my chin. "Drop it, Art," Miller said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "Do not make me paint this room with your brains. Put it down." Harrison hesitated for a second, weighing his options. But Arthur Harrison was a survivor, not a martyr. He let out a shuddering breath and opened his hand. The revolver clattered onto the floor next to my ear. "Get off him," Miller barked. Harrison slowly raised his hands and rolled off me. The deputies were on him instantly, driving his face into the rug, the same rug hiding the evidence that would bury him. I scrambled backward, gasping for air, clutching my bruised ribs. I looked toward the door. Sarah was standing there, trembling, her hands covering her mouth. I crawled over to her and pulled her into a hug, burying my face in her shoulder. "You saved me," I whispered into her hair. "You saved us, Sarah." "I called it in," I said to Miller, as he hauled Harrison to his feet. I tapped the face of my smartwatch. When I saw his car pull up, I held the SOS button. I knew he wasn't bringing lasagna. Miller nodded grimly. "Good instinct, James. We were already halfway here. We found the emails on your mother's phone draft folder. We were coming to ask you about Harrison anyway." They dragged Harrison out of the house. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the floor, a man who knew his gamble had not just failed, but had destroyed him. The fallout was swift and brutal. With the documents I found under the floorboards and the testimony of Randall Jenkins, who sang like a bird to avoid the death penalty, the case against Harrison was airtight. He was charged with money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of first-degree murder, as the orchestrator of the crime. But the hardest part was not watching Harrison fall. It was watching Kevin break. 2 days later, I went to the county jail. Miller allowed me to speak to Kevin through the glass one last time. I told him everything. I told him about the water. I told him about the cartel money. I told him that Harrison had bought his debt specifically to use him. "He played you, Kevin," I said, my voice hollow. "There was never going to be any forgiveness. If you had gotten Dad to sign, Harrison would have killed you next to tie up the loose end. You were not a partner. You were the murder weapon." Kevin sat there in his orange jumpsuit, staring at his reflection in the glass. When the reality finally sank in that he had killed his parents, not for survival, but because he was a gullible pawn in a game he didn't understand, he didn't get angry. He shattered. He slid out of his chair and curled up on the linoleum floor of the visitation booth. He began to scream. It was a sound of absolute soul-crushing regret. He screamed until the guards had to drag him away. He screamed until his voice gave out. He pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid a trial. The judge showed no mercy. Kevin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die in a cage just like he had left our parents to die in one. The funeral took place on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after the silence had begun. It rained. Of course it rained. The sky over Stone Creek was a sheet of relentless gray, weeping onto the muddy earth of the family cemetery behind the orchard. There were not many people. The scandal had kept the fair-weather friends away. It was just me, Sarah Sheriff Miller, and a few of the old ranch hands who had worked for my father for decades. I stood by the open graves, holding a large black umbrella over Sarah. She was wearing a black dress that was slightly too big for her. She did not cry. I do not think she fully understood that they were never coming back, or perhaps in her world, death was just a long sleep. When the priest finished his prayer, Sarah stepped forward. She was holding her favorite teddy bear, a ragged thing with one eye missing. She knelt in the mud, ignoring the rain soaking her knees, and placed the bear on top of my mother's casket before they lowered it. "For sleeping," she whispered. "So Mom is not scared in the dark." I broke down then. I wept silently, the tears mixing with the rain on my face. I wept for the parents I had lost, for the brother I had hated and pitied, and for the years I had wasted in Seattle thinking I was too good for this place. That evening I sat in the living room. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet now. The ghosts had been laid to rest. My phone buzzed. It was my boss from the firm in Seattle. He was asking when I would be back. He talked about the deadlines, the new library project, the partnership track. "I am not coming back," I said. "James, take some time," he urged. "You are grieving. Don't make rash decisions." "It is not a rash decision," I said, looking at Sarah, who was sitting on the floor, coloring a picture of a horse. "It is the only decision. I am resigning. Effective immediately." I hung up the phone. I was not an architect anymore. I was a rancher. I was a brother. I had 3,000 acres of land, a multi-million-dollar aquifer that I would protect with my life, and a sister who needed me. The next morning, I took a screwdriver and a hammer upstairs to Sarah's room. I took the door off the hinges. I carried the white wooden door with the painted flowers down the stairs and out to the burn pile in the backyard. Then I went to the guest room and took that door off too. Then the master bedroom closet. I removed every single closet door in the house. There would be no more hiding in this house. No more secrets. No more dark corners where fear could fester. If we had demons, we would face them in the open, in the light of day. 6 months later. The snow is gone, replaced by the vibrant green of early summer. The air smells of pine resin and sagebrush. I am sitting on the front porch drinking coffee from my father's old mug. My hands are rougher now, calloused from mending fences and working the herd. I am tired, my back aches, and I have never been happier. In the paddock, Sarah is brushing the coat of an old mare named Bessie. She is humming a song off-key and happy. She looks back at me and waves. I wave back. We are broken people, Sarah and I. We are the survivors of a shipwreck that drowned everyone else. But we are here. We are standing on the shore. I learned the hard way that blood does not make you family. Blood is just biology. Kevin was blood, and he was the knife in our backs. Harrison was family by friendship, and he was the architect of our destruction. I watched Sarah lean her forehead against the horse's neck, finding comfort in the simple warmth of a living creature. Family isn't blood. Family are the people who stay. Families are the ones who stand beside you when the storm strips away the roof and the walls. And the only thing left is the truth. I take a sip of coffee and look out at the mountains, standing guard over my home. The silence is gone. The wind is singing in the grass, and for the first time in a long time, I like the song. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It was a journey into the darkest parts of human nature, and I appreciate you walking this path with me. I would love to know where you are listening from. Are you safe at home on a long drive, or maybe working late? Comment your location below so we can share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to Calm Revenge stories like this video and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people. Stay safe and watch out for the quiet ones.